Very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would welcome the opportunity to sit down with you in other settings on a bipartisan basis to talk through some of the issues. The President's Fiscal Year 2011 budget focuses on three things: job creation in the near term, strengthening the middle class, and beginning the difficult work of putting us back on a path to fiscal sustainability. First, a little bit of economic background. We have just come through a year in which we averted a second Great Depression. At the end of 2008, the economy was declining at more than a 5% annualized rate. At the end of 2009, it was increasing at more than a 5% annualized rate. Although real GDP is now expanding, the employment market remains too weak. The unemployment rate is 10%, and there have been 7 million jobs lost since December 2007. In that context, the President has put forward a jobs and wages tax credit intended to spur hiring, especially among small businesses, along with other key investments including in infrastructure, education, clean energy, and innovation. Second, a little bit of background on our fiscal context and the pre-existing condition we faced at the beginning of 2009. In January 2009, before the Obama administration took office, CBO issued an economic and budget outlook which clearly showed an increase in spending from 20.9% of GDP in fiscal year 2008 to 24.9% of GDP in 2009, a 4 percentage point increase in spending as a share of the economy, again, before the administration took office. The reality has turned out roughly consistent with that projection. Spending in 2009 was 24.7%, a different mix. Mandatory spending was lower, discretionary spending somewhat higher, in part because of the Recovery Act, than what was initially projected. Similarly, with regard to our medium-term deficits, as of January 2009, we faced an $8 trillion 10-year deficit, which can be attributed to two basic forces. One was the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts not being paid for, along with the Medicare prescription drug benefit not being paid for. And the second was the economic downturn. The first factor, deficit financing of the tax cuts and the drug benefit, raised the deficit by more than $5 trillion. The second factor, the economic downturn, by reducing revenue and increasing certain kinds of spending, raised the deficit by more than $2 trillion. Now that's all fine and well and provides the facts about where we found ourselves. The question is, what are we doing about it and how are we addressing both problems? I already mentioned that the President has put forward a jobs package intended to spur hiring in the near term. What about our medium-term deficits? The first thing we are doing is, and the first thing that should be done, is to avoid making the problem worse. The administration is pleased that the Senate has now joined the House in passing statutory pay-as-you-go legislation, which embodies the simple but important principle that when you face a hole, you shouldn't make it any deeper. If we had lived by this rule in the past, our out-year deficits would be roughly 2% of GDP, debt as a share of the economy would be declining, and our fiscal outlook would be significantly different. Second, economic recovery will help to reduce the deficit. We project that economic recovery will help to reduce the deficit from about 10% of GDP this year to roughly 5% of GDP by 2015. That is higher than we would like, and so we have put forward specific policies to reduce it further. In particular, $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction embodied in this administration budget, more deficit reduction than in any president's budget submission in more than a decade, and sufficient to cut the deficit in half as a share of the economy by the end of the president's first term. What are we talking about? A financial services fee which will raise $90 billion, allowing the 2001 and 2003 tax legislation for those making more than $250,000 a year to expire as scheduled next year, which will reduce the deficit by almost $700 billion. Eliminating fossil fuel subsidies to help move the nation towards a clean energy future, reducing the deficit by $40 billion. And a 3-year freeze on non-security discretionary spending, reducing the deficit by $250 billion over the next decade, even while investing in key areas like education, R&D, and clean energy. Finally, and I see that my time is running out, Even with those steps, the hole that we face is so deep that we will still not get to where we need to be, which is why we are calling for a bipartisan fiscal commission to work together and come up with additional measures that will help reduce our deficits further and put us on a stable fiscal trajectory, not only over the next decade, but thereafter. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back to you, and I'd welcome any questions.